Chapter 47, In Protective Custody. After about an hour's wait, Ari was at last escorted in by secretary. As soon as he entered the room, he could sense the animosity. He was no longer one of them. He'd already been written off as the enemy. Besides the chief and David, the other four were strangers to Ari. He knew of them by reputation, but had never met any of them, nor was he properly introduced now. The chief simply recited their names and positions as a matter of formality. No one made a move to reach out and shake the hand Ari offered, then withdrew in embarrassment. As soon as Ari was seated, the chief turned on a tape to record the proceedings. "You're a very clever man, Thalberg," he began, "and we had hoped to use your considerable talents on other assignments around the world. But now we've got a problem, and I'm going to level with you right up front. Your story, and admittedly we haven't heard all the details yet, is completely contradicted by other impeccable testimony that's been made available to us." "If you mean Antonio del Sasso's version of what happened," responded Ari, "then I'm not too surprised. Nor should you be. He's Israel's enemy." "What proof do you have of that?" demanded the chief. "David knows that I'd been contacted several times by an entity. He calls himself Alor of the Nine. That's the group of extra-dimensionals who gave Del Sasso his powers and who work with the CIA. They wanted to use me to destroy Zionism and internationalize Jerusalem, which at that time I thought would further the cause of peace." "That whole extra-dimensional intelligence thing is a bunch of garbage, not worthy of sane conversation," interrupted Shimon derisively. "Shimon's the one who did the investigation on that," added the chief, backing up his man. "Garbage? That's odd," returned Ari. "I was told by someone present in this room that the CIA was in touch with ETIs who possibly didn't have physical bodies, which would make them EDIs. He turned to David for corroboration. "I was misinformed," muttered David apologetically, "which I only found out a few minutes ago." "Hold on," insisted Ari. "Some of your men, when you had me under surveillance, saw Alor and the incredible things he did." "That was the preliminary report, but now there's some dispute about what they really saw. Some confusion," said David lamely. "You can't change your tune so easily," protested Ari. He turned to the chief. "One of your own people did an article in the Post about the involvement of ETIs in psychic research and the scientifically acceptable possibility that they might have evolved beyond the need of bodies. What about that?" "There's a big difference between ETIs and EDIs," declared Shimon. "That whole EDI hoax was perpetrated by Carla Bertelli, and we fell for it until we learned the facts. It was a diversion that was invented to explain the destruction Korev and Bertelli planned. But I'm not telling you anything you didn't know." "I resent that," responded Ari hotly. "You're accusing me." "Let's get down to the facts," said the chief. "You told two of our men on the way to the San Francisco airport that the floor of the auditorium opened up and dropped you into an underground cavern." "That's right," nodded Ari. "Investigators have carefully sifted through the ruins, searching for bodies, trying to make identification of remains, and to find the cause of the explosion. And although the floor is buckled and torn up in places, there's absolutely no sign of any opening such as you describe. Furthermore, geologists over a period of many years have mapped that area thoroughly looking for oil and minerals, and there has never been any indication of an underground cavern of any kind, much less of the proportions you report." "Geologists have been wrong thousands of times," retorted Ari. "They don't know everything. I'm telling you the cavern's there. I think I could find the place where I got out. Let's go over there and I'll prove it." "You think you could?" "I'm sure I could. It's not very large, but—" "We're not flying off to California on hopes and dreams. This big hole in the floor that you fell through, it just sealed itself?" asked the chief sarcastically. "I can't explain that. But do you think I could make up such a story?" countered Ari. "You're clever enough to make up anything. That's why it's so puzzling that you'd come up with such an unlikely fiction. Did you really think we'd believe that wild tale?" "It's not fiction or a wild tale. I'm telling you the truth. It's not the kind of tale I'd come up with if I were lying. I'd invent something more believable. You've been watching too much TV, lost touch with reality. I think you need some psychiatric help. Ari took a deep breath. If I'm as clever as you suggest, then surely if I were fabricating a story, I wouldn't come up with something as bizarre as falling into an underground cavern, would I? I'd simply say that I stepped out of the auditorium to go to the men's room, or to get a breath of fresh air, or something like that, right? I think you're clever enough, suggested Moshe Yishai, to come up with a wild tale just so you could use that argument. A genius out of touch with the real world. What I went through in that hellhole, protested Ari, my imagination couldn't concoct anything like that. It's a miracle I got out alive. It's all on the tape. Listen to it. Or I'd be happy to go through it again. The men around him shook their heads and looked at one another as though they felt sorry that such a brilliant person had lost his mind. Their performance was almost enough to cause Ari to wonder whether he had lost touch with reality. No, he wouldn't succumb to their game, if that's what it was. Yes, what he had lived through was fantastic, beyond belief, but it had really happened. Okay, said Ari with a shrug. I don't know what I can do to convince you of that part. Forget it for a moment. What we need to get down to, and it's all on the audio tape I gave David, are the incredible things that happened in the auditorium before the whole thing blew up. That's what's important. I'm telling you, Israel's in danger. This guy Del Sasso, exactly where were you when the explosion took place? Cut in Yossi Meidlin, the Mossad explosive specialist. As I told Mike and Sam, and you'll find all the facts on the tape in great detail, I wasn't aware of any explosion until I saw it on the news when I got to the hotel the next night. That must have happened after 30 of us went through the floor. Back to Fantasyland again, interrupted Shimon with disgust. So what happened to the other 29 who all supposedly fell into the same place you did? You tell me what happened to them. I'll bet my life that none of the remains have been identified, or ever will be, as belonging to any of the media people who were present. We don't have a report on that, cut in the chief, but I'm sure they'll be found. If they are, you can take me out and shoot me, declared Ari confidently. Well, back to your story, persisted the chief. You say they fell into the same hole you did. Why didn't any of them survive and get out? I don't know. After falling what seemed like hundreds of feet, I happened to hit a steep sandy slope and slid into a big rock that kept me from going on over a cliff. That's what saved my life. The others must not have been so lucky. I heard the screams of people falling beyond me. After I regained consciousness, I yelled for them, but got no answer. It was dead silence and total blackness in there. Del Sasso, in a sworn statement to the FBI, says you were never there, interjected Eiten Yar, who had been closely watching Ari in silence. That lying devil! Ari had turned red with anger. He says, persisted Eiten, that he specifically asked Ms. Bertelli where the Jerusalem Post reporter was, and that she seemed embarrassed and said something about your being delayed, but you'd be there soon. That's a lie. She introduced me to Del Sasso, and we had a conversation that left me very uncomfortable. I wasn't dreaming. I was there, and talked to him. Did someone give you a ride into town in a pickup? Asked the chief. Yeah, 50-ish, long hair and beard, tanned, hillbilly English, a refugee from the hippie era. A news report of the destruction and loss of life came over his radio. You heard it, but said nothing to him about being there. Doesn't that seem like an unnatural reaction? If you'd gone through that Holocaust and escaped, not to say anything about it? Not at all. I was on a secret mission. I had information that I wanted to bring back to Israel, and I didn't want to be held up by the local police, the FBI, or whoever might have taken me into custody for lengthy questioning if I'd let them know that I was a survivor. I wanted to tell you the facts, not them. Doesn't that make sense? You told him, and the hotel clerk, the same story about being lost in the woods, falling over a cliff. I had to tell them something. That seemed the most likely explanation for my bruised and bloodied appearance. The chief nodded to Yossi. Read him the pertinent part of the FBI report. Yossi pulled some papers out of his briefcase and began to read. Del Sasso, unconscious from smoke inhalation and internal injuries, was found by firemen next to the corpse of Korev. This is consistent with his story that he saw Ms. Bertelli and Korev suddenly leave, suspected something, and ran after them. Bertelli had disappeared, but he caught Korev. They argued. Korev seemed anxious to get out of the building. There was a huge explosion, and that's the last he remembered until he came to the hospital. Bertelli didn't have a scratch. Yet she claims that when she made her escape by a stage exit, everyone else, except Korev and Del Sasso, who were both battered, was already dead. And how did they die? According to Bertelli, they were hit by falling chunks of ceiling, and many were impaled by splinters of the laminated overhead beams that pursued their targets like guided missiles. "That's right," interjected Ari. "I saw it happen." "We know your stories agree," said Yossi sarcastically. "She even says, like you, that the floor opened up and the entire press section fell through. Her description of what happened inside the auditorium before the explosion sounds like a horror movie. It's beyond belief for the real world. But let me go back to the FBI report verbatim. Bertelli also claims that Del Sasso was already in the lobby waiting for her when she got there. Not only does this conflict with his testimony, but with the location where he was found. If he'd been in the lobby, why would he have gone back toward the auditorium after the explosion? And how could he have gotten to the lobby ahead of both Bertelli and Korev if he left the auditorium after they did? As for Ari Thalberg— "That's enough," interrupted the chief. He turned to Ari. "We think you're lying, Thalberg. You were never in that auditorium." "They checked my name off at the gate when I entered." "That's the first thing the FBI thought of. And your name is one of 3 that were not checked off. The other 2 became ill at the last minute and didn't make the trip." "Somebody's doctored the records. I saw the guard put the check by my name with a pen." "I believe the FBI," insisted the chief. "Not always, but in this case. There were about 200 other media persons around the gate. All have been contacted, and none remembers seeing you." "That's a joke. How would they know what I looked like? I hadn't been outside of Israel." "There were reporters from Paris and Berlin and other cities who knew you in the past as Professor Hans Mueller. They didn't see you go in." "I was in a car when we went through the gate. They weren't peering in the windows." "None of the drivers taking delegates from the San Francisco airport remembered you." "The FBI is covering up," protested Ari. "I'll take a polygraph test right here in Israel from your best experts. Go into the minutest details of what I saw happen. Then compare it with what Bertelli says. Check the phone records. I've talked to her once since I last saw her 4 years ago in Paris. You've seen all my letters to her and hers to me. When could we possibly have rehearsed?" The chief cut him off. "We're going to investigate this in detail, just as the CIA is also doing. I don't know all the answers yet, but at the moment, the evidence points to a conspiracy between Korev, Bertelli, and you. She rescued Korev from the KGB in Paris. Now the KGB says it was staged by Korev and a rogue agent named Chernov, who later attacked that same CIA installation. Korev and Bertelli were working together, there's no doubt. You knew her in Paris years ago, had contact with her there just before you came to Israel, and she brought you into the project to provide an alibi. It was a setup from the start." "Absolutely preposterous," interjected Ari, beside himself with anger and frustration. "What motive could either Bertelli or I have for wanting to destroy— You both believe that Jesus was the Messiah and that he's coming back to rule the world, right?" Ari nodded. "If you take what the Hebrew prophet said, you can't come to any other conclusion." The chief held up his hand in protest. "Don't try to convert me. The fact is that what you both believe about this supposedly resurrected Jesus coming back to rule the world is in irreconcilable conflict with the New World Order that we're all working for. There's your motive. It springs from religious paranoia." Ari opened his mouth to respond, but the chief cut him off again. "This is still under investigation. You haven't been charged with any crime, yet. But until it's resolved, I'm placing you under protective custody. Get your suitcase and go with Yossi and Moshe. They'll take you to a safe house. You'll be under 24-hour guard. Don't make it difficult for us."